Friends, if you are excited to watch the thrilling and action-packed upcoming movie The Amateur 2025 in English, then you are going to absolutely enjoy this video. And if you are visiting our channel for the very first time, I would love for you to subscribe because we bring you all the latest, most exciting, and most detailed updates about your favorite movies. In today's video, we are going to dive into the world of The Amateur 2025, a film that promises edge-of-your-seat suspense, high-stakes drama, and a gripping storyline that will keep you hooked from start to finish. We are going to explore everything about this movie. What makes it special? What is the story behind it? Where and how you can watch it? And all the hidden and surprising facts that fans are going to love. Not just that, we will also tell you on which OTT platform or satellite TV channel you can catch this movie when it releases. Whether you are someone who enjoys the big screen cinema experience, or someone who prefers to watch from the comfort of your home, I will walk you through the best ways to watch The Amateur 2025, so you can enjoy it in the fullest and most exciting way. But that's not all, friends. We will go deep into the technical departments of the movie. How was the movie made? What kind of special effects, stunts, and visuals have been used? We will also talk about the music department. What kind of soundtrack does this movie bring? How does the background score build tension? And who has worked behind the scenes to bring that audio magic to life? We'll also explore the pre-production journey, how this movie came into existence, how the idea developed, and how the team got together to start this thrilling project. We will move through the filming phase, where the action really happens on set, and the post-production phase where all the final touches, editing, visual effects, and sound design come together to shape the final version of the movie you will get to see. I will also tell you about the budget of the film, how much was invested to bring this ambitious story to life, and how it performed at the box office. Was it a massive hit? Did it surprise the audience with its success? Or was it a quiet performer that found its audience slowly? We'll discuss all of that. But wait, there's more. I will take you through the detailed storyline of the film, so you can get a good idea of what this adventure is all about, without giving away the big surprises. I will share a mini review so you can understand the mood, the energy, and the emotional punch the film delivers. And yes, we will talk about some of the most interesting facts connected to this film, details that will make you appreciate it even more. We will go over the full star cast, talk about the lead actors, their performances, how they prepared for their roles, and who has played which character in the story. Every character brings something unique, and I will make sure you get a complete picture. That's why I invite you, friends, to stay with me till the very end of this video. There's a lot of exciting, detailed, and fun information coming your way that you wouldn't want to miss. So, without any delay, let's start the video and jump right into the world of The Amateur 2025. The story of The Amateur 2025 wastes absolutely no time pulling the audience straight into the heart of personal tragedy. It opens with a CIA cryptographer, a man who is more at home surrounded by codebooks, classified files, and computer screens than by guns and danger. His life is structured, quiet, and carefully controlled, far away from the world of field agents and violent confrontations. But this safe, ordered life is shattered in an instant when his fiancée is killed in a brutal terrorist attack. This is not just some random act of violence. It becomes the emotional spark that sets the entire narrative ablaze. His grief is not quiet, it is roaring, and his desperation quickly hardens into determination. The story immediately stands out, because it doesn't start with a hero. It starts with an ordinary man who is suddenly forced to step into a world he has never been prepared for. What makes the structure of The Amateur 2025 gripping is that it tricks the audience early on. It sets you up to expect the classic spy thriller beats, but then it carefully pushes you into a raw, more personal journey. It doesn't lean on slick gadgets or global conspiracies right away. It digs into the question of what happens when the system you work for turns its back on you. The protagonist's first big moment comes when he demands that the CIA take action against those responsible, only to be coldly dismissed. The agency buries itself in protocol, red tape, and political agendas, refusing to pursue justice. This isn't the story of a well-trained operative given the green light. This is a story about a man who is completely alone, stripped of resources, and told to walk away from his pain. But walking away isn't in his nature. This is where the story flips. Instead of sitting behind a desk, He forces himself into the dangerous world of espionage, driven by raw emotion rather than skill or strategy. And that is where the beauty of the narrative shines. He is not smooth. He makes mistakes. He takes wrong turns. He misjudges people. His inexperience makes every encounter feel dangerous because he is constantly in over his head. This is not a man pulling off impossible stunts with perfect precision. He struggles, he panics, and he learns in the most brutal ways possible. And the story lets you sit in that discomfort. It doesn't offer him an easy transformation into a super agent. His journey is messy and painful, and that is what makes every moment feel alive. As he pushes forward, the movie begins to play with shifting perspectives. It cleverly shows how the trained operatives around him view him as nothing more than a nuisance. A man too emotional, too reckless, too unqualified to make a difference. But the more he digs, the more the so-called professionals start to take him seriously. He is a threat not because of skill but because of his refusal to stop. The narrative toys with this growing sense of danger. The audience watches as his persistence forces powerful people to come out of hiding. His amateur status becomes his greatest weapon. No one expects him to get this far. The movie does something smart with time and pacing. It doesn't sprint from one action scene to the next. It slows down to let the emotional weight linger. It sits in the silences, in the quiet hotel rooms, in the lonely train rides, and in the brutal moments of self-doubt. And then when the action does explode, it hits hard because the stakes have been carefully built with patience. The fights aren't polished or perfectly choreographed. They are desperate, ugly, and unpredictable. And every injury, every scrape, every near-death experience feels earned because the protagonist is always a heartbeat away from failure. The deeper he goes, the more the story pulls back layers of corruption. He uncovers secrets that not only tie the terrorists to shadowy enemies, but also to the very organization he trusted. His friends start to look like enemies, and his enemies seem to have more complicated motives than simple cruelty. The alliances in the story constantly shift, making it impossible to tell who is truly on his side. And this keeps the narrative sharp and alive, as no one can be trusted for long. One of the film's most fascinating turns is how the protagonist begins to change. He starts off as a grieving fiancé, desperate to do something, anything. But by the time he reaches the final leg of his journey, he has crossed so many moral lines that even he begins to question who he has become. The story doesn't offer him a simple path back to his old life. He is forever altered, carrying the scars, the guilt, and the knowledge that he became someone his past self would barely recognize. The weight of this transformation hits deeply, because the audience has traveled every painful step alongside him. The narrative of The Amateur 2025 refuses to be a straightforward revenge story. It is layered with emotional depth, shifting loyalties, and the tension of watching an ordinary man fight battles he was never trained to win. It is not just about whether he succeeds, it's about what he loses along the way and how the journey redefines him in ways that feel uncomfortable, raw, and utterly unforgettable. The character development in The Amateur 2025 is a slow-burning, deeply personal evolution that never feels rushed or superficial. Every layer of the main character is peeled back with precision, and the movie allows the audience to sit inside his skin, to experience his fear, confusion, rage, and slow, agonizing transformation in real time. This is not a story about a seasoned agent flawlessly carrying out missions. This is the story of an ordinary man, who is violently dragged into an extraordinary world, and forced to find out what he's truly capable of when the systems around him fail. He begins as a quiet, measured CIA cryptographer, a man whose job revolves around cracking codes, analyzing intelligence, and staying far, far away from field assignments. His life is built on safety, logic, and routine. But his entire existence is shattered in a moment when his fiancée is killed in a terrorist attack. That loss becomes the central fire driving his journey, and it immediately pushes him into emotional territory where the usual rules no longer apply. What makes his character so compelling is that he doesn't leap into action with confidence. He's hesitant. He's broken. He is consumed by grief but has no clue what to do with it. His first instinct is to turn to the system he has dedicated his life to, trusting that the agency will pursue justice. But when he is stonewalled by bureaucracy, ignored by his superiors, and told to stand down, the helplessness begins to twist into rage. The refusal of the CIA to take action doesn't just disappoint him, it fundamentally betrays him. This betrayal lights a fire that propels him into a world he is completely unprepared for. He doesn't have field training, he doesn't know how to handle weapons, and he isn't used to the split-second decisions that can mean life or death. He is in every sense an amateur. But what makes his arc so powerful is that he chooses to step into that world anyway. He chooses to fight, not because he's ready, but because he simply cannot do nothing. The story allows him to fail over and over again. His inexperience is never hidden. He is clumsy, reckless, and often one step behind his enemies. He misreads situations, he trusts the wrong people, and he underestimates the brutality of the forces he is up against. Every injury he suffers, every trap he walks into, every time he scrambles to escape with his life, these moments stick to him. They shape him. They teach him lessons he never wanted to learn. And the beauty of his growth is that it doesn't happen through some magical training montage or sudden acquisition of skills. He grows through sheer survival. He adapts because he has to. He endures because there is no other choice. Each decision, each painful step, forces him further away from the man he used to be. The grief that once consumed him evolves into a cold, focused determination. And the audience gets to watch this hardening happen in a way that feels raw and believable. His relationships throughout the story are never straightforward. The people he meets along the way aren't just placeholders. They are fully realized characters with their own desires, fears, and shifting loyalties. Some are reluctant allies who help him but question his motives. Others are seasoned operatives who mock him, seeing him as nothing more than a foolish man stumbling into a world he cannot survive. And some, the most dangerous ones, present themselves as friends while secretly leading him deeper into traps. What's fascinating is how his perception of these people changes as he changes. At first, he clings to anyone who offers help. He's desperate, naive, and assumes people will be honest. But betrayal after betrayal strips away that innocence. His understanding of trust evolves from blind acceptance to sharp-eyed suspicion. By the middle of the story, he has learned to question every hand extended toward him, to read the silences between words, and to survive in a world where no one is truly what they seem. The antagonists are far from being simple villains. They aren't just mindless terrorists or corrupt officials. They are people embedded deep within the system he once believed in. They are people who understand the weight of the power they hold, and are willing to wield it ruthlessly to protect their interests. The protagonist's growing awareness of how deeply the rot runs is part of his emotional journey. His fight is no longer just against the people who took his fiancée. It becomes a fight against the institution that abandoned him, that allowed this chain of events to unfold, that turned a blind eye to corruption and terror in favor of political convenience. The more he uncovers, the more personal it gets, and the more it pushes him to the edge of his own morality. His internal battle is where some of the film's richest character work happens. As his skills slowly improve, as he begins to outwit and outfight people who once dismissed him, he finds himself slipping further away from the man his fiancée knew. He wrestles with whether he is becoming the very thing he set out to destroy. He is haunted by the question of whether the price of vengeance is worth losing the last pieces of himself that he once valued. The story doesn't shy away from showing the toll this journey takes on him. There are moments of intense guilt, moments where he stares at his own reflection, and doesn't recognize the man looking back. He is not immune to the emotional damage of the things he does, and the weight of that hangs over him, scene after scene. The supporting characters have arcs of their own. Some who initially doubt him begin to grudgingly respect him. Others who appear helpful reveal themselves to be more interested in protecting their own secrets than in aiding his quest for justice. Relationships that begin as alliances splinter into rivalry. Trust is earned and then shattered. No connection in the story is static, and this constant movement in the emotional and relational landscape keeps the narrative tense and unpredictable. Even the smallest characters carry depth, with motivations that ripple through the story in surprising ways. By the time the protagonist reaches the climax of his journey, he has transformed entirely. His amateur status never fully leaves him, but he is no longer the man we met in the opening scenes. He has survived betrayals, violence, moral compromises, and staggering grief. And each of these trials has carved him into something sharper, harder, and more dangerous. His growth is not a clean arc. It is jagged, filled with painful choices and irreversible losses. The movie builds his transformation piece by piece, never skipping the messy middle, and allows the audience to feel the weight of everything he gains and everything he sacrifices. His character journey is a brutal, honest exploration of what happens when an ordinary man is forced to become something extraordinary, and what that transformation ultimately costs. The performances in The Amateur 2025 are the beating heart of the film, the element that carries its raw power and emotional depth from start to finish. The lead actor completely inhabits the role of the grieving CIA cryptographer, and what makes his performance so unforgettable is that he never takes the easy road. He doesn't try to play the part like an action star with slick moves and effortless confidence. Instead, he allows the character's pain to fill every movement, every glance, every ragged breath. His grief is not a passing plot point. It sits with him, it weighs him down, and the actor makes sure the audience feels that unbearable load in every single frame. His face tells stories even when he says nothing. The flickers of doubt, the flashes of panic, the moments where his body seems to collapse under the strain of what he's enduring. These moments make his performance feel painfully authentic. The way the lead actor portrays the transition from a man behind a desk to a man standing in the crosshairs is done with extraordinary patience and precision. He doesn't wake up one day ready to fight. He stumbles through it, battered by his own fear and driven by something far more chaotic than skill, pure, untamed desperation. His body language tells the story before his words do. In the early stages, he walks into danger like he doesn't belong, his shoulders tight, his stance awkward, his movements hesitant. As he is pulled deeper into the labyrinth of violence, betrayal, and survival, that awkwardness doesn't vanish. It morphs. He moves with more grit, but never with the grace of a professional. And that choice by the actor makes every success feel like a hard-earned miracle. His breathing quickens in moments of danger. His hands tremble when holding a weapon. His reactions are often just a fraction too slow. And all of this grounds the story in realism. The standout moments come when the performance dips into the quiet. The way the actor handles the silences, the scenes where he is alone, broken, and unsure of who he's becoming. Those moments carry so much weight. There's a particular richness in the way he looks at photographs of his fiancée. How the grief crashes into him with the same intensity as the violence he's enduring. He plays the character like a man who is trying to survive the mission, but barely surviving himself. Even when the action roars around him, his sadness never slips away. It is always sitting just beneath the surface, ready to overwhelm him at any moment. The supporting cast does not simply orbit around him, they shape him. There are characters who initially see him as a liability, a man they view with open disdain, and the actors in these roles play that contempt beautifully. The dismissive glances, the sarcastic remarks, the subtle body shifts when he enters a room. These actors don't need grand speeches to establish their superiority. They exude it with every gesture. Yet as the story progresses, their performances evolve. Slowly, they begin to convey small cracks in their armor. Tiny signs of growing respect or reluctant acknowledgement that this amateur, this outsider, is surviving in a world designed to destroy him. The shift is so gradual that when it lands, it feels earned. The actors never force it. They let it seep in quietly, allowing the audience to catch the change on their own. Among the supporting cast, there are those who play morally gray characters whose allegiance is never clear. These performances are magnetic because the actors masterfully balance charm and menace. They can deliver a friendly line with a dangerous undertone, and they hold their secrets tightly. The way they interact with the protagonist is laced with double meanings, calculated silences, and subtle manipulations that constantly keep the audience guessing. One minute they offer a helping hand. The next they step away just when the stakes are at their highest. The actors playing these roles bring a quiet unpredictability that feeds the tension, making every alliance feel fragile. The performances from the antagonists are chillingly effective. These are not loud, explosive villains who announce their evil intentions. Instead, they speak calmly, with a cold precision that makes them all the more terrifying. The actors bring a kind of unsettling control to these roles. They don't need to raise their voices to dominate a scene. They can break the protagonist's spirit with a steady gaze, with the slow, deliberate way they move, with words that cut like a knife precisely because they are delivered without emotion. Their restraint is what makes their performances so powerful. They feel real because they aren't caricatures. They are people who know how to hide behind systems and institutions, people who don't need chaos to win because they have the machinery of power on their side. The emotional weight of the film is carried not just by the lead, but by the entire cast. There are smaller roles, informants, ex-operatives, handlers, who each bring their own emotional layers to the story. Some carry guilt, some carry fear, and some simply want to survive. The actors in these parts make even the briefest appearances feel like fully realized moments. They don't just deliver lines and exit. They leave behind traces of themselves in the story, building a world that feels thick with history and hidden agendas. The chemistry between the lead and the supporting characters is sharp and alive. The tension in their conversations is electric because the actors don't just speak at each other. They push, they pull, they maneuver through layers of distrust and shifting power. Every glance, every pause, every carefully measured word adds to the web of suspicion and uneasy alliances. These are not comfortable relationships. They are full of doubt, quiet tests, and emotional undercurrents that the actors bring to life with precision. The action sequences themselves are elevated by the performances, because the actors never make them feel clean or choreographed. The lead's fear is visible in his eyes, his exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders, his panic in the frantic way he moves through a gunfight. The actors playing the professionals carry themselves with the brutal confidence of people who have lived through 100 battles. They handle their weapons with calm efficiency, their breathing steady, their steps measured. The contrast between their deadly precision and the protagonist's chaotic scrambling creates a tension that the actors maintain perfectly. The performances in the Amateur 2025 do not just support the story, they shape it. They make the world feel brutal, unpredictable, and deeply human. Every actor, whether in the spotlight or just passing through a scene, commits fully to their role. They layer every interaction with complexity, ensuring that no moment is simple, no relationship is flat, and no decision feels weightless. They turn the story into something more than a revenge mission. They turn it into an emotional battleground, where survival is not just about outsmarting or outgunning the enemy. It's about holding on to the pieces of yourself that haven't yet been torn away. The direction of the Amateur 2025 is not simply about guiding the story from one scene to the next. It is about crafting a relentless emotional experience that never gives the audience a chance to feel comfortable. The director does not allow the film to follow the easy, well-trodden path of a typical spy thriller. Instead, the entire vision of the film is built around the feeling of being trapped, of being one step behind, of gasping for air while the walls close in. From the very first frame, the tone is established with a weighty, almost suffocating stillness. The opening scenes don't rely on flashy introductions or rapid editing. They are patient. They sit in the grief of the protagonist. They force the viewer to feel the silence, the absence, the aching loss that defines his life from the moment his fiancée is taken away from him. The director's control over pacing is one of the most gripping aspects of the film's identity. There is no rush to plunge into action, no hurry to speed toward big set pieces. The pacing is deliberately stretched at times, pulling the audience into long, quiet stretches where the protagonist is simply sitting in the wreckage of his life, where the clock seems to slow as his grief tightens its grip on him. These moments are not fillers. They are part of the story's tension. The longer the camera lingers on him, the more the emotional pressure builds. When the action finally does arrive, it is jarring, loud, and immediate, creating a violent contrast that shocks the system. This manipulation of tempo is one of the director's most effective tools. The audience is never allowed to settle into a rhythm because the film constantly shifts from aching silence to brutal intensity. The director's visual style is carefully selected to keep the story grounded in realism. The camera often stays close to the protagonist, almost uncomfortably close, following his frantic movements, shaky breathing, and the chaos of his decisions. During action sequences, the camera doesn't pull back to show slick choreography. It stays in the mess with him, capturing the clumsy, desperate scrambles, the near misses, the painful crashes. The camera work is intentionally claustrophobic, especially in the early parts of the film, where the protagonist feels small and powerless. The shot compositions box him in, frame him against towering buildings, long corridors, crowded city streets, and rooms that feel too tight to breathe in. It's a visual language that perfectly reflects his place in the world. He's outmatched, outnumbered, and out of his depth. As the story progresses and the protagonist begins to carve out his own space in this brutal world, the director subtly adjusts the visual framing. The camera starts to give him more room. He stands taller in the frame. He takes up more space. The city still feels like it's closing in, but now he's pressing back against it. This visual evolution is not loud or obvious. It's stitched quietly into the fabric of the film, a slow and powerful shift that matches his emotional journey. The lighting continues to play a significant role throughout, leaning into a palette of cold blues, sharp grays, and deep shadows that wrap the entire film in a mood of isolation and danger. But there are rare moments where the lighting softens, usually when the protagonist allows himself to remember his fiancée, and these brief pockets of warmth feel precious, fragile, and quickly swallowed back by the surrounding darkness. The director also layers the film with symbolic visual patterns. Mirrors, glass reflections, and moments where the protagonist's image appears fractured or doubled repeatedly remind the viewer of his broken identity. He is not whole. He is constantly split between the man he was before the attack and the man he is becoming. These visual cues are not decorative. They are deeply tied to the emotional structure of the film. They quietly remind the audience that his transformation is not clean or complete. Even as he gains control, parts of him remain shattered. The director's handling of dialogue scenes is just as precise as the action. Conversations are not rushed or packed with unnecessary explanations. They are tight, often filled with long pauses, shifting eye contact, and carefully measured silences that carry as much weight as the words spoken. The director uses stillness to build pressure. When characters speak, they rarely say exactly what they mean. Their body language, their tone, the distance between them, these elements do the real talking. The power dynamics in these conversations shift quickly, and the director keeps the audience on edge by refusing to telegraph whether each interaction will end with a deal, a betrayal, or an ambush. The sound design, shaped under the director's watchful eye, is another layer that intensifies the film's unique rhythm. The quiet moments are often punctuated by the hum of a distant train, the soft buzz of fluorescent lights, or the faint ticking of a clock, creating a subtle background noise that amplifies the feeling of tension without overwhelming the scene. When violence erupts, the sound is sharp, loud, and unfiltered. Gunshots ring out without the usual cinematic polish. Fights feel messy, brutal, and fast, with the grunts, crashes, and gasps left raw and close to the ear, making the audience feel as though they are in the middle of the struggle. The transitions between scenes are handled with a fluid, almost dreamlike touch. The director often blends the sounds from one scene into the next before the visuals follow, creating a seamless connection that keeps the film's emotional flow intact. These transitions give the film a sense of continuous motion, even when the story pauses to explore quieter moments. It feels like the protagonist is trapped in an unbroken chain of events, unable to catch his breath, unable to escape the weight of his mission. The environments in the film are treated with the same care. The director avoids sprawling, picturesque landscapes in favor of gritty, confined spaces. The city feels alive but suffocating, a web of alleys, rooftops, and narrow stairwells. The locations are chosen not for spectacle but for their ability to trap, confuse, and pressure the protagonist. Each setting feels like another layer of the maze he is trying to escape, adding to the sense that he is always being watched, always being hunted. Throughout the entire film, the director's control over tone remains razor-sharp. The story never slips into glamour, never lets the violence feel heroic, never allows the protagonist to become untouchable. Every choice, from the color grading to the camera angles to the pacing of the cuts, is designed to remind the audience that this is a story of desperation, of grief, of someone punching far above their weight and barely surviving. The director steers the film away from the polished, high-sheen world of typical spy thrillers and drags it into something messier, heavier, and far more intimate. The vision behind the Amateur 2025 doesn't just tell the story. It traps the audience inside it, forcing them to live every tense, painful, claustrophobic second right alongside the protagonist. The cinematography in The Amateur 2025 is not just a backdrop to the story. It is an aggressive, living part of the film that reaches out and pulls the audience into the protagonist's suffocating world. Every camera movement, every choice of lens, every carefully framed shot is designed to not just show the story, but to make the audience feel it in their bones. From the very beginning, the cinematographer chooses to trap the protagonist inside tight, compressed frames. Wide-open spaces are rare, and when they do appear, they feel overwhelming, vast in a way that emphasizes his smallness and isolation. But mostly, the film is built from close-ups and claustrophobic tracking shots that follow him relentlessly, pressing in so tightly that the edges of the screen feel like they're closing around him. It creates the sensation that the protagonist cannot escape, not from his grief, not from his pursuers, not from his own unraveling mind. The use of camera angles throughout the film is sharp and deliberate. When the protagonist is lost, grieving, or overpowered, the camera often shoots him from high angles, reducing his presence within the frame, making him look like a man crushed by forces far larger than himself. In conversations with those who outrank him or who manipulate him, the camera frequently sits behind his shoulder, peering over him but always leaving him slightly out of focus, as though he is slipping from control, even from the narrative itself. The cinematographer constantly tilts the visual balance to make him look off-kilter, often leaning the camera ever so slightly or framing him just outside the natural center, subtly telling the viewer that nothing about his journey is stable or safe. Lighting is used not just to set mood, but to carve out emotional spaces within each scene. When the protagonist is consumed by grief, the lighting is harsh, cold, and angular. He walks through streets bathed in flickering artificial lights, through rooms with deep, sharp shadows, through corridors where the only illumination comes from a dying bulb or the distant glow of headlights. These choices are not random. They amplify the protagonist's emotional collapse, wrapping the frame in loneliness and tension. There are entire sequences where light seems to physically retreat from him, where he walks into spaces and becomes partially swallowed by shadow, as though even the environment is abandoning him. In moments of violence or panic, the lighting shifts quickly, sometimes allowing harsh glares, bright flashes, or sudden silhouettes that throw the scene into visual chaos. The cinematographer's grip on light is ruthless, making sure that it works hand in hand with the protagonist's mental state, shifting from suffocating coldness to jagged, disorienting brightness in the blink of an eye. The framing throughout the film is one of its most emotionally loaded techniques. The protagonist is repeatedly boxed in, trapped within door frames, shot through bars, fences, window panes, even through crowds of people where he seems walled off from the rest of the world. These visual cages are constant, silently echoing his feeling of entrapment, of being cornered by systems, grief, and violence that he cannot escape. The cinematographer uses reflections with brutal effectiveness. There are numerous moments where the protagonist is seen not directly, but as a fragmented image in broken mirrors, puddles, windows, glass partitions, and these visual choices are never decorative. They scream the reality that his identity is splitting apart, that he is losing the man he used to be. The action sequences are captured with a sharp, almost documentary-like realism. The camera doesn't hover safely outside the fight. It crashes into the brawls, follows too close, shakes with the impact of each blow, scrambles with the protagonist as he runs, stumbles, or desperately tries to find cover. The cinematographer resists the temptation to create wide, clean shots of stylized combat. Instead, the action feels like an extension of the protagonist's panic, unsteady, breathless, sometimes partially obscured, as though the camera itself can't fully process the speed and brutality of what's happening. The cinematography leans into this chaos, refusing to glorify the violence, forcing the audience to feel the rawness of every punch, every fall, every deafening gunshot. But the cinematography also knows when to slow down and hold still. There are breathtakingly heavy pauses, long-held shots that let the protagonist's grief simmer without distraction. These shots are patient. They stay with him as he sits alone, as he walks aimlessly through half-lit streets, as he stares at objects tied to his fiancée's memory. In these moments, the camera almost feels like it's standing at a distance, observing him, letting his emotional weight press against the silence. Sometimes the cinematographer keeps the frame so still that the smallest movement, a shift of his hand, a trembling breath, feels enormous. This control over the rhythm of stillness and motion is one of the most striking features of the film's visual language. The urban setting is captured with a deliberate hostility. The streets are not beautiful. They are cluttered, tight, full of sharp edges and hidden spaces where danger waits. The cinematographer uses long lenses to compress the space, making alleys feel tighter, making buildings seem to lean toward each other, making the entire city seem like it's folding in around the protagonist. Rooftop chases, dark stairwells, abandoned lots. Each location feels carefully chosen to trap, to corner, to disorient. Even when the city appears to open up, when the protagonist stands in a wide plaza or a long tunnel, the cinematography makes those spaces feel empty in the most brutal way. They are not places of freedom. They are places where the protagonist's loneliness roars in his ears. Depth of field is wielded as a precision tool. In tense moments, the cinematographer often isolates the protagonist by keeping him razor-sharp in focus while the background dissolves into a soft blur. This isn't just about visual clarity, it's about locking the audience into his experience, cutting out distractions, forcing them to process the world exactly as he does. When the tension is high, the background sometimes pulses with movement. Shadows, people, cars, but it all feels distant, irrelevant, because the lens traps the viewer's attention completely on the protagonist's ragged breath, his bloodied hands, his trembling resolve. The moments when the film dips into memory or flashes of the protagonist's past are treated with a different visual texture. The cinematography softens here, but it does not offer comfort. The light warms slightly, the focus deepens, but there's always a haze, a delicate distance, a suggestion that these memories are slipping away, that the protagonist is losing his grip on them. These scenes don't last long, and they often dissolve back into the cold, sharp present without warning, snapping the protagonist, and the viewer, back into the cruel reality he's trying to survive. Throughout the amateur 2025, the cinematography is relentless in its mission to visually trap, corner, and emotionally wring the protagonist. The camera does not offer safety, does not step back to admire the action from afar, does not allow the story to escape its own weight. Every lighting choice, every frame, every angle pushes the viewer deeper into the world of a man who is fumbling, suffering, and surviving in a space that was never designed for him. The editing and pacing in the amateur 2025 are not just technical choices. They are the lifeblood of the film's experience. The editors don't simply piece scenes together to create a neat timeline. They construct an emotional roller coaster that drags the audience into the fractured, chaotic, grief-stricken world of the protagonist. From the very beginning, the editing builds a pulse that feels uneven, raw, and uncomfortably intimate. It's a pulse that speeds up and slows down in direct response to the protagonist's internal state. When he is lost in grief, the pacing stretches endlessly, forcing the audience to sit in the suffocating quiet. When he is pushed into frantic chases or violent confrontations, the cuts become urgent, jittery, and sharp. The editors make the story feel alive, like it's breathing directly alongside him. Sometimes calm, sometimes panicked, always unpredictable. The film does not follow a comfortable or traditional pacing structure. The editors refuse to spoon-feed the viewer with predictable rhythms. Scenes do not always open with wide establishing shots or gentle lead-ins. Often, the film drops the audience directly into the middle of a moment, sometimes cutting into conversations already in progress or opening action sequences mid-struggle, without explanation. This style keeps the audience alert, as though they are constantly playing catch-up, as though they have been yanked into the protagonist's urgent, reactive world where nothing is fully explained, and there is never time to prepare. The pacing constantly shifts gears, jolting from breathless action to quiet grief without warning. These sudden changes in tempo are not mistakes. They are the foundation of the film's intensity. They replicate the protagonist's experience of being emotionally and physically whiplashed by everything happening around him. When the protagonist is trapped in his grief, the editing slows to a crawl in the best possible way. Scenes are allowed to stretch beyond what might be expected. There are moments where the camera lingers on his face for far longer than usual, where his silence speaks louder than words, where the editors choose to let the emptiness and stillness ring out like deafening echoes. These moments are heavy and uncomfortable because the audience is forced to stay with him, to sit in the suffocating weight of his sorrow. The film does not rush past his pain. It lets the viewer feel every second of it. The editing holds the silence, making sure the gravity of his loss stays front and center, even when the story threatens to move forward. When the pace accelerates, the editing slashes through scenes with an urgency that feels chaotic but deliberate. The action sequences are not stitched together to create perfect rhythm and flow. Instead, they are cut to feel ragged, unsteady, and dangerously fast. The edits feel breathless because the protagonist is breathless. The cuts are tight, fast, and sometimes intentionally jarring, giving the viewer no time to settle, no time to prepare for the next shot. The editors don't clean up the fights, they let the mess stay. There are moments where the camera loses the protagonist in the chaos, where the editing holds just a beat too long on his stumbles or missteps, where the rhythm falters in a way that perfectly mirrors his inexperience and desperation. The pacing in these scenes never allows the action to feel like a polished dance. It feels like a brutal, frantic struggle for survival. One of the most interesting editing techniques throughout the film is the use of sound-driven transitions. Scenes often bleed into each other not through visuals, but through audio. The sounds of a following scene, footsteps, a train, distant sirens, sometimes begin before the previous scene has fully ended. This technique creates a sense of constant forward momentum, of time slipping without control, of life refusing to pause for the protagonist's grief. It makes the transitions feel seamless, like the story is always pulling the audience forward, sometimes faster than they are ready to move. The editors are careful to never let the film feel like it's stopping. It's always pressing on, always pushing, always dragging the protagonist through his painful evolution whether he's ready or not. The film plays with time in subtle ways. The editing sometimes skips over moments that other films would linger on. There are jumps in the timeline that are not always marked by clear visual cues. The story sometimes vaults forward in time by a few hours or days, forcing the audience to quickly reorient themselves, just as the protagonist is scrambling to do. This irregular pacing keeps the viewer unsteady, perfectly reflecting the disorientation that comes from grief, from panic, from suddenly being thrown into a life where everything is moving too fast and nothing makes sense. These time jumps are not confusing, they are purposeful. They show that the protagonist is missing pieces, that his life is slipping through his fingers faster than he can track. The editing uses memory in a sharp, invasive way. Flashbacks and emotional intrusions don't arrive with soft fades or slow dissolves. They often snap into the narrative, sometimes cutting in with the suddenness of a triggered memory, sometimes flashing in and out with jarring speed. These memory sequences feel like emotional ambushes. The protagonist cannot control when they hit him, and the editing makes sure the audience feels that same lack of control. Sometimes the memories linger for a few seconds. Sometimes they stutter like broken film reels, flickering and vanishing before the protagonist can fully grasp them. The editing never lets these flashbacks feel comforting. They feel like ghosts, like painful, fragmented shards that pierce through the present without warning. The editors are also smart about pacing in the quieter moments. They know exactly when to let scenes breathe, and when to cut away. There are long shots where the protagonist is simply sitting, walking, or staring at something that carries emotional weight. These scenes stretch just enough to let the sadness build without becoming stagnant. And then, without telegraphing the change, the film snaps the audience into the next burst of movement, the next urgent chase, the next brutal confrontation. This rhythm of expansion and contraction, of lingering and jolting forward, creates an emotional cadence that perfectly matches the protagonist's spiraling journey. The film's rhythm is not about consistency, it's about honesty. It speeds up when his adrenaline spikes. It drags when his grief anchors him. It stutters when his panic takes over. The editing is wired directly to his heartbeat, his breathing, his unraveling sense of time. It makes the story feel like it's happening in real time, like the audience is experiencing the disorientation, the exhaustion, the rawness of his struggle alongside him. Even when the film slows down, it never fully lets go of its tension. There is always an undercurrent, always a ticking clock, always a sense that the next threat is only a breath away. The pacing isn't perfect because the protagonist isn't perfect. The rhythm isn't smooth because his life isn't smooth. The editing keeps the story rough, human, urgent, and deeply connected to his emotional core. The editors refuse to create a clean, stylized spy thriller. They craft something messy, immediate, and deeply personal. The soundtrack and score in The Amateur 2025 are not just atmospheric layers draped over the film. They are deeply embedded in the emotional DNA of the story. Every note, every rhythm, every carefully timed silence is meticulously crafted to mirror the protagonist's fragmented mind, his relentless grief, and the volatile world he's thrown into. The music doesn't simply accompany the visuals. It pushes, pulls, distorts, and amplifies the emotional charge of every moment, sometimes guiding the audience gently, sometimes grabbing them by the throat without warning. What makes the score so captivating is its refusal to settle into conventional patterns. It isn't here to deliver sweeping heroic themes or predictable action beats. It's built to breathe alongside the protagonist, to collapse when he collapses, to tremble when he trembles, to rage quietly when he rages. The composer has made the bold choice to keep the score intimately tied to the protagonist's psychological rhythm, rather than to the physical pace of the film. This means that even in action sequences, the music sometimes resists the obvious path. Where most films would explode into percussive, fast-paced crescendos, The Amateur 2025 often holds back. The score retreats into subtle, tense sound beds, low vibrating bass, slow, echoing pulses, that make the danger feel colder, heavier, and less like a spectacle. This restraint is powerful. It forces the audience to focus not on the adrenaline, but on the crushing emotional weight that follows the protagonist in every violent encounter. These action scenes don't feel like victory laps. They feel like desperate, ugly scrambles to survive, and the music supports that completely by refusing to glorify the fight. There's a recurring musical motif that haunts the film from beginning to end. A soft, ghostly sequence of piano notes that always arrives in the quietest moments, often connected to the protagonist's memories of his fiancée. This motif is heartbreakingly fragile. It flickers in and out, sometimes so faint it almost disappears into the ambient city noise. The way this musical thread weaves through the story creates a deep emotional connection. It's not just background. It becomes a sound that belongs to his grief, a sound that belongs to her memory. The composer uses this motif with incredible care, never overplaying it, never making it feel forced. Sometimes it plays as the protagonist walks through the streets, sometimes it barely brushes the edge of a scene as he looks at an object tied to her memory, sometimes it lingers longer when he's close to breaking. It's a sound that doesn't demand attention but slowly carves itself into the viewer's subconscious, so that every time it returns, it lands harder. The soundtrack also makes brilliant use of ambient sound blending. The city's heartbeat, its sirens, its distant voices, its rattling subways, often bleeds into the score, blurring the line between diegetic and non-diegetic sound. The composer doesn't try to separate the music from the environment. Instead, the soundtrack feels like it's stitched into the very streets, the walls, the air the protagonist breathes. In chase sequences, the clang of footsteps, the echo of shouts, and the roar of passing vehicles sometimes weave directly into the rhythm of the score, creating a relentless pulse that doesn't feel like music layered on top. It feels like music growing out of the chaos itself. Silence is perhaps the most devastating tool in the entire soundscape. The composer and sound designers understand that sometimes the absence of music can be more powerful than any soaring theme. The film uses silence not as a break, but as an emotional weapon. There are entire scenes where the music drops away completely, leaving only the scrape of shoes, the hollow hum of a city that no longer cares, the quiet sob of a man alone with his grief. These moments hit like a punch because they strip away all the narrative distance, forcing the audience to experience the protagonist's loneliness in raw, unfiltered detail. The silence lingers just long enough to make the viewer uncomfortable, to make them want to escape the weight of it, but the film doesn't let them. It holds them there, in the heavy quiet, until the tension becomes almost unbearable. There are other clever musical decisions that subtly guide the emotional flow, without calling attention to themselves. Sometimes the score will build a quiet, simmering tension underneath dialogue-heavy scenes, using faint rhythmic pulses that seem to speed up as the protagonist becomes more agitated. These almost subliminal cues keep the pressure mounting, even when the scene on the surface appears calm. It's a masterful manipulation of emotional tempo, using the soundtrack to create a sense of urgency where the visuals might not immediately suggest it. The use of diegetic music, sounds and songs that exist within the film's world, is sprinkled throughout in a way that deepens the texture of the story. A street performer's melody might drift through a scene just long enough to echo a memory. A song on a nearby radio might linger awkwardly during a tense confrontation. These pieces are never random. They're chosen to layer additional meaning into the environment, to give the city a voice of its own, and to sometimes highlight the brutal contrast between the normal world and the protagonist's spiraling collapse. The editors and sound designers often let these diegetic sounds drift in and out, sometimes fading them into the score itself until the distinction between what is real and what is internal becomes beautifully blurred. In moments of collapse, when the protagonist breaks down under the crushing weight of grief or guilt, the music sometimes fractures alongside him. The composer introduces sharp, fragmented sounds, dissonant piano chords, abrupt electronic stabs, warped echoes, that mirror his mental and emotional disintegration. The score doesn't hold his hand through these moments. It crumbles with him, splinters with him, staggers alongside him. It's as if the music itself is breaking apart, refusing to offer stability or comfort when he no longer has any. Even the closing scenes of the film refuse to resolve the music into a neat, satisfying conclusion. The score lingers in that same quiet pulse, leaving the audience with a musical aftertaste that feels unresolved, unfinished, deliberately raw. The composer resists the pull of closure, choosing instead to leave the story musically open-ended, as though the protagonist's grief, his amateur struggle, his quiet, desperate resilience will continue long after the credits roll. The soundtrack and score in The Amateur 2025 are some of the most emotionally intricate and tactically restrained elements of the entire film. They are not loud, they are not flashy, they are not engineered for easy catharsis. They live quietly inside the film, sometimes haunting, sometimes pulsing, sometimes suffocating, always present, always connected to the heartbeat of the man at the center of it all. It is music that breathes with him, falls apart with him, and keeps moving forward even when he is crawling. The score and silence work together to create a soundscape that makes the viewer feel like they are inside his grief, inside his panic, inside his stubborn fight for something that feels just out of reach. It is a soundtrack that lingers long after the film is over, like a distant, unresolved echo that refuses to fade. The themes and messages in The Amateur 2025 are woven so tightly into the fabric of the story that they don't feel like separate lessons waiting to be discovered. They feel like the oxygen the film breathes, present in every glance, every mistake, every silence. The film does not preach, it does not guide the audience to a tidy resolution, and it certainly doesn't hand over its ideas on a silver platter. Instead, it throws the viewer into a swirling sea of grief, rage, powerlessness, and moral uncertainty, letting these complex themes rise naturally from the protagonist's chaotic, stumbling journey. Each theme grows sharper the deeper you follow him, and the film never lets you escape their weight. At its very core, The Amateur 2025 is a ruthless dissection of grief, the kind that suffocates, the kind that warps perception, the kind that convinces a person that they must act, even when that action might destroy them. The protagonist's grief is not quiet, not soft, not a poetic sadness that can be packaged neatly into a lesson. His grief is violent, impulsive, stubborn, and raw. The film explores how grief can consume a person's identity and blur the boundary between love and obsession. The protagonist's journey isn't about finding peace. It's about trying to claw his way to something that feels like purpose after his life has been shattered. But the film never gives him the satisfaction of that purpose. It constantly forces him to confront the possibility that no amount of violence, no mission, no target will ever fill the chasm left by his fiancée's death. The story pushes the uncomfortable idea that grief might not be something you solve. It might be something you simply survive. The theme of revenge is stitched directly into this grief, but the film never treats revenge as something righteous or cleansing. It tears apart the fantasy that vengeance brings closure. The protagonist latches onto revenge because it's the only thing that gives his unbearable pain a shape, a direction. But the film carefully dismantles this illusion, showing that each act of revenge only deepens his loneliness, widens the emotional distance between who he was and who he's becoming. There is no moment where revenge feels triumphant. It feels bitter, it feels hollow, it feels like a slow self-erasure, and the film doesn't flinch from that. The protagonist's pursuit becomes a desperate attempt to control something, anything, in a world where he has lost control over the most important thing in his life. Control itself becomes one of the film's most fascinating themes. The protagonist enters this brutal world believing that with enough force, enough speed, enough cleverness, he can bend the system to his will. But the film repeatedly breaks this notion. It shows him chasing targets, making deals, dodging bullets, all while realizing that he is just a small, powerless piece in a much larger machine that doesn't care whether he wins or loses. The more he fights to take control, the more the story strips it away from him. He is pushed into situations where his choices barely matter, where the weight of institutional power crushes his personal mission without hesitation. The film forces the audience to sit with this unsettling reality, that sometimes, even the most determined individual can't bend the world to their grief, no matter how hard they try. The protagonist's status as an amateur is not just a plot device. It's a central theme that challenges the glorification of expertise and professionalism in thrillers. This story is not about a perfectly trained spy executing flawless missions. It's about a man crashing into a world he does not understand, making messy decisions, fumbling through deadly situations, and constantly falling short of what the professional version of this story would expect. The film embraces his lack of polish, his missteps, his panic. It invites the audience to experience what happens when an ordinary man tries to navigate an extraordinary and unforgiving system. His amateur status is not just his weakness, it's his humanity. The film questions whether being professional in this world simply means becoming emotionally numb, losing touch with why you fight in the first place. There is a persistent undercurrent of moral ambiguity running through every layer of the story. The protagonist's mission feels personal and urgent, but the film keeps pulling the rug out from under him. Are the people he's targeting really the ones responsible? Are his allies using him? Are his enemies worse than the system that created them? The film refuses to draw clean moral lines. It challenges the viewer to question whether revenge is justified, whether violence ever really serves justice, and whether grief is a valid excuse to blur ethical boundaries. The protagonist becomes trapped in his own blurred moral compass, and the film leaves the audience in that same uncomfortable space, where there are no obvious answers, only painful compromises. One of the film's most crushing messages is about the insignificance of the individual when pitted against the machinery of institutional power. The protagonist is not fighting a single villain. He is fighting sprawling, faceless systems that operate far beyond his reach. Intelligence agencies, covert operations, political games, they move on with or without him, indifferent to his pain. His story, his loss, his desperate mission. All of it is a footnote in the grander scheme of international politics and espionage. The film hammers this home again and again, showing that institutions absorb violence, betrayal, and sacrifice like a sponge. They do not shatter under the weight of his struggle. They barely notice. This brutal message lingers over every scene. The idea that sometimes the fight isn't against a person, but against a structure so large it cannot be toppled by grief, no matter how ferociously it's wielded. Memory is another theme that quietly but powerfully shapes the story. The protagonist's memories of his fiancée are fragmented, shifting, and sometimes intrusive. The film suggests that memory is not always a faithful companion. It can be selective, it can protect, it can deceive. The way the protagonist remembers her is not always complete, not always objective. The film plays with the possibility that he is chasing not just revenge, but a version of her that he has crafted to survive his guilt and pain. The audience is left to question whether the story he tells himself about their love and about her death is true, or whether it has been twisted by the unbearable weight of loss. Isolation runs like a steel thread through the entire film. The protagonist is surrounded by people, informants, agents, enemies, but emotionally he is stranded. His grief isolates him. His mission isolates him. His inability to trust isolates him. The deeper he falls into this violent world, the more the film locks him inside his own headspace, where even fleeting connections with others feel fragile, temporary, and tinged with suspicion. The film captures the deep, crushing loneliness of loss, the kind that lingers even in the middle of a crowd, even in the heat of action. Another quietly devastating theme is the price of unfinished grief. The protagonist throws himself into this mission as a way to avoid the stillness, to outrun the silence that grief demands. The film shows that this constant motion, this obsession with doing something, anything, to fill the void is its own form of self-destruction. The visual effects and CGI in the amateur 2025 operate like a silent accomplice to the story, never stepping into the spotlight, but always working in the shadows to stitch the world together with careful precision. The beauty of the film's visual design lies in how effortlessly the effects dissolve into the film's harsh, gritty reality. This isn't a movie that leans on glossy spectacle or gravity-defying mayhem to make its mark. It lives in a world where danger has weight, where destruction leaves scars, and where visual effects are deployed not to impress, but to trap the audience inside the protagonist's crumbling perception. The film's most striking visual choice is how it constantly blends practical effects with digital ones in a way that feels seamless, even invisible. When cars explode, the fire doesn't spiral into a towering CGI inferno. It clings low and dirty to the asphalt, enhanced just enough by digital layers to give the blast texture, depth, and urgency. The CGI isn't there to turn action scenes into fireworks shows. It's there to support the rawness of the moment. A flipped car lands with a crunch that feels fully grounded, real metal smashing into real pavement, but the visual effects step in just enough to pepper the air with debris, to deepen the smoke, to expand the scope without breaking the physical integrity of the scene. The result is action that feels brutal and immediate, not choreographed for visual flair but clumsy and dangerous, exactly as it should in a story where the protagonist is barely surviving. What's brilliant about the film's use of visual effects is that they quietly shape the world in ways the audience may never consciously notice. The city feels alive, but that energy isn't just from shooting in crowded streets. It's the result of subtle digital crowd extensions, slight manipulations of traffic flow, and careful layering of background movement to create the illusion of a city that never pauses. There are moments when streets that would have looked sparse in raw footage now pulse with the low, constant buzz of people, cars, lights, and the never-ending churn of urban life. It makes the city feel oppressive, like it's always closing in, like it never gives the protagonist space to breathe or hide. The CGI is also used to subtly distort space in a way that presses psychological tension into the visuals. Certain alleyways feel unnaturally narrow. Some street corners seem sharper, more angular than they should. Skylines stretch just a little higher. Buildings loom just a little too close. These are not glaring, obviously manipulated shots. They are almost subliminal tweaks that shift the geography of the city to reflect the protagonist's mental collapse. The visual effects team uses this spatial manipulation to make the world feel like it's trapping him, constantly squeezing him into tighter corridors, reducing his options, making escape feel physically impossible even when the path is right there. Technology in the film is represented with sleek, but minimal digital effects. Tracking screens, encrypted files, surveillance grids. These visuals are presented with a cold, matter-of-fact precision. There's no flashy, animated digital overload. Everything feels stripped down, efficient, almost surgical. The digital interfaces are quick, sharp, and unforgiving, often flashing across the screen without lingering, just enough for the audience to catch them and feel the pressure of moving through a world driven by data and surveillance. This choice emphasizes that the protagonist is navigating a landscape dominated by systems far more advanced than he can control. He is always 2 steps behind, racing against cold, mechanical processes that don't care about his emotional urgency. The way CGI is used in the film's gunfights and close-quarters combat is another place where restraint dominates. Bullet impacts are sharp, quick, and often brutal, but they are never exaggerated. The film doesn't lean into stylized slow-motion blood sprays or overblown impact craters. The visual effects are carefully calibrated to make every gunshot feel like a terrifying, immediate threat, not a visual celebration of violence. Windows shatter with tight, focused blasts, with splinters realistically, and the environment absorbs damage in a way that feels tactile. CGI steps in only to amplify these moments with details like debris spray, smoke curls, or environmental crumbling that would be impossible to capture fully in camera, but never distracts from the scene's grounded energy. One of the most powerful and unexpected uses of visual effects comes in the depiction of memory. The protagonist's recollections of his fiancée and their life together are visually distinct, but the film never telegraphs these moments with cliché soft focus or exaggerated dream filters. Instead, the visual effects create subtle shifts. Edges of the frame blur ever so slightly, colors become just a fraction warmer, lighting softens almost imperceptibly. Sometimes, these memories bleed into his present-day surroundings, with light flickers or faint overlays that haunt him in the corners of his vision. The digital manipulation here isn't about creating fantasy. It's about making the intrusion of memory feel like something creeping just out of reach, something real enough to disorient, but intangible enough to remain painfully distant. The visual effects also contribute to the protagonist's physical deterioration. Cuts, bruises, swelling. All of these are carefully tracked with practical makeup and subtly augmented with digital touches to make sure they evolve correctly over time. His wounds darken, his skin splits further, and the weight of his injuries accumulates in a way that's brutally honest. The CGI doesn't turn him into an action hero who walks away from explosions without a scratch. It holds him accountable for every hit, every fall, every crash, showing that he's breaking down, and that breaking is not something that can be covered up with a bandage in the next scene. When the film does unleash larger-scale destruction, the effects maintain the same grounded approach. Explosions remain tight and contained, vehicle crashes remain governed by real-world physics, and digital fire and debris are layered carefully to enhance rather than dominate the frame. There's a conscious decision to resist making these moments feel spectacular. They are meant to feel dangerous, not cinematic. The destruction carries emotional weight, because it happens in a world that feels vulnerable, that feels like it can't easily reset after each blast. There's no reset button. Damage lingers. Even the sound design works in harmony with the visual effects to keep the immersion intact. The sharpness of bullet ricochets, the crackle of fire, the collapse of walls. All of it is paired with effects that match the scale and tone without ever pushing into over-the-top territory. The explosions sound close, dangerous, intimate, not the rumbling, echoing blasts of action blockbusters. The sound and visuals combine to trap the audience inside the immediate, ground-level chaos of each scene. There are moments when the visual effects are so tightly woven into the cinematography that it's nearly impossible to distinguish where the practical world ends and the digital world begins. Reflections in glass, distant helicopters, rain patterns, and environmental transitions are all touched by CGI in small, meticulous ways that never feel artificial. The set design and locations in the Amateur 2025 aren't just backdrops. They are living, breathing extensions of the story. The environments are soaked with tension, memory, and emotional weight, and every single location feels like it's been carefully chosen to press against the protagonist, to trap him, to reflect his fractured mental state. The world in this film is gritty, textured, and utterly believable, not in a polished postcard-perfect way, but in a way that feels worn-in, scarred, and quietly suffocating. The production design builds a world where nothing feels staged, nothing feels manufactured for the camera. Everything feels like it's been sitting there long before the story began, pulsing with history, decay, and life. The urban spaces the film moves through are an extraordinary piece of world-building. The city is not shot like a glamorous playground for spies. It's shot like a maze, tight streets, twisting alleys, cluttered markets, underground parking structures, worn-down apartments. These aren't shiny sets built to showcase action. They're rough, imperfect, and deeply alive. The city is packed with layers. Street vendors spilling onto sidewalks, rusted fences leaning into pedestrian paths, cracked pavement patched over with mismatched concrete. It feels chaotic and organic, like a place where the protagonist can disappear one moment and be cornered the next. The set design builds this constant, oppressive energy where the walls seem to close in, and the streets never quite open wide enough. The protagonist's apartment is a perfect example of how the set design tells its own story without a single line of dialogue. His living space is a cluttered archive of his grief. Half-packed boxes, untouched stacks of documents, a jacket still hanging by the door that should have been taken down months ago. The apartment isn't a home. It's a holding cell where time has stalled. The lighting is cold and flat, the furniture is sparse, and the walls seem to shrink as the story progresses. It's not a place of comfort. It's a physical map of his emotional paralysis, a quiet monument to everything he's lost. Government buildings and agency offices are another triumph of the film's set design. These spaces are not grand or intimidating in the traditional sense. They are sterile, boxy, and suffocating. Endless hallways painted in drab colors, flickering fluorescent lights, security checkpoints that feel more dehumanizing than protective. The walls are lined with bland motivational posters and old, stained ceiling tiles that buzz faintly overhead. These details build the brutal bureaucracy the protagonist is trying to break through. The spaces feel intentionally cold, designed to make the individual feel small and forgettable, which perfectly supports the film's themes of powerlessness and institutional indifference. Safe houses, underground garages, and off-the-grid meeting spots are all drenched in authenticity. These aren't flashy hideouts packed with high-tech gadgets. They are grimy basements, abandoned storage units, rundown hotel rooms with peeling wallpaper and stained carpets. These locations feel risky, temporary, like they've been cobbled together out of desperation, and that sense of instability wraps itself around the protagonist's every step. The set design refuses to give him comfort or security. Every space he enters feels like it's moments away from collapse. Public spaces in the film carry their own narrative weight. Crowded train stations, grimy subway platforms, smoke-filled bars. All of these locations pulse with unpredictable life. The film makes sure that no crowd is just background noise. The people brushing past the protagonist, the strangers sitting 2 tables away, the faces he can't quite see clearly. There's always a subtle threat in these spaces, a feeling that danger could come from anywhere. The way these locations are dressed with flickering signage, dented vending machines, half-lit stairwells, and scuffed seating creates a sensory overload that mirrors the protagonist's spiraling focus. The props scattered throughout the film are chosen with surgical precision. The protagonist's maps are frayed and scribbled on, not polished digital displays, but folded paper worn thin at the edges. His phone is cracked, his weapons are scratched and mismatched, his clothes are functional but increasingly threadbare. There's an intentional absence of high-tech, glamorous spy gear. Instead, the film leans into low-tech, gritty survival tools, old notebooks, cheap prepaid phones, hand-sketched diagrams. These props build a world where the protagonist is always improvising, always scraping by, never comfortably outfitted for the mission he's undertaken. Even the cars in the film tell stories. They're not sleek sports cars or bulletproof tanks. They're dusty sedans, beat-up vans, and aging hatchbacks. The vehicles feel lived in, with fast food wrappers in the back seat, cracked dashboards, and stubborn doors that don't quite shut right. The set design and prop work come together to build an aesthetic that is deeply unpolished, which perfectly matches the protagonist's status as an amateur trying to operate in a professional's world. There's a brilliant use of transition locations, neutral spaces like cafes, metro stations, parking decks, that the film revisits with shifting tones. The same location can feel like a safe checkpoint in one scene and a looming threat in another, depending on the protagonist's mental state and the narrative tension. This flexibility in the set design allows the locations to evolve as the story tightens around him, constantly reshaping the emotional weight of familiar spaces. Abandoned buildings play a critical role in the film's third act, and they are designed with stunning attention to decay. Flaking paint, hanging wires, forgotten paperwork, smashed windows. The production design makes these places feel like they've been left behind not just by people but by time itself. These empty, crumbling spaces echo the protagonist's isolation and amplify the sense that he is now moving through places where even the systems he's fighting have stopped paying attention. The film's outdoor locations often feel just as claustrophobic as the interiors. Narrow bridges, fenced-in rooftops, tight alleyways. All of these spaces are used to create visual and emotional pressure. Even when the protagonist is technically outside, the locations are chosen and shot in ways that strip away the usual openness. There's nowhere to run, no wide escape, no distant horizon. The set design boxes him in with scaffolding, barricades, parked trucks, and looming buildings that cut off sightlines and trap sound. The film's use of color and texture in its set design is meticulous. The palette leans into cold grays, muted greens, and washed-out browns. There are few moments of vibrant color, and when they appear, a red door, a bright scarf, a neon sign, they snap into focus as sharp points of contrast, signaling danger, memory, or emotional weight. The world feels stripped of comfort and warmth, which perfectly aligns with the story's emotional tone. What makes the set design in The Amateur 2025 so captivating is that it never feels like a series of constructed stages. It feels like a real, fully functioning world that has no interest in accommodating the protagonist. The locations aren't there to serve him. They're there to challenge him, to disorient him, to reflect his descent into obsession and desperation. The dialogue and script in The Amateur 2025 cut with a sharp, stripped-down precision. There's no wasted breath, no unnecessary flourishes, no grand speeches that pull the viewer out of the moment. The writing is lean, tense, and raw, shaped perfectly to match the film's brutal pacing and the protagonist's increasingly fractured mindset. The conversations never feel like set pieces or crafted showcases. They feel like desperate attempts to grasp control, dodge danger, or cut through lies before it's too late. The beauty of the script lies in its restraint. It knows when to let silence hit harder than words, and when a simple sentence can land like a punch to the gut. There's a constant edge to the dialogue, as if everyone in this world is measuring every syllable, weighing what they reveal and what they hide. Characters rarely say more than they need to, and when they do, the tension climbs because those moments feel like dangerous slips rather than heartfelt admissions. The protagonist's lines are often clipped and urgent, the language of a man who is not a polished operative, but someone clawing his way through conversations he's not trained to win. He speaks like a man on borrowed time, someone who doesn't have the luxury to impress or persuade. His words come out fast, blunt, and sometimes awkward, but that's what makes them ring true. There's a distinct rhythm to the way the script handles dialogue. Some conversations are razor-sharp exchanges loaded with subtext, where what isn't said hangs heavier in the air than what is. Other moments drag into these jagged pauses where the silence between words carries unbearable weight. The script knows exactly how to make these pauses sting, forcing the audience to sit in the uncomfortable gaps where grief and uncertainty creep in. The pacing of the dialogue keeps the viewer trapped in the protagonist's crumbling headspace, where even quick back-and-forths can feel like walking a tightrope. One of the standout qualities of the writing is its refusal to over-explain. The protagonist is thrust into the world of espionage without a manual, and the script never pauses to hand the audience a tidy briefing. Characters drop jargon, references, and warnings with the assumption that if you don't keep up, you're already a step behind. This choice pulls the audience directly into the chaos, forcing them to learn the stakes, the players, and the risks at the same jagged pace the protagonist does. The script trusts the audience to piece it together, which heightens the immersion and keeps every exchange loaded with tension. The emotional weight of the story is not carried by flowery declarations. It's carried by moments where the characters stumble, where they choke on their own rage, where they try and fail to say what matters. The protagonist has these clipped, desperate phone calls where you can feel him grasping for control, trying to keep his voice steady as his grief surges underneath. There's one particularly haunting line where he snarls, "I don't need to survive this. I just need to finish it." It lands like a slab of concrete, not because it's delivered with theatrical flair, but because it feels like the brutal, unvarnished truth of where his head is. The script is peppered with moments of sharp wit, but not in the breezy, punchline-driven style of most thrillers. The humor here is dry, bitter, and often cuts with more pain than levity. Characters trade verbal jabs that feel like self-defense mechanisms, as if humor is the only way to hold back the emotional collapse that's constantly threatening to break through. A cynical agent might mutter, "You think you're playing their game? They built the table." It's the kind of line that sticks, not because it's flashy, but because it encapsulates the brutal futility the protagonist is up against. The supporting cast adds layers of complexity to the script through their clipped, evasive, and sometimes intentionally misleading dialogue. You can feel the power dynamics shifting in real time through the way characters choose their words. Allies sound almost indistinguishable from enemies, and the script crafts these moments where you can never quite tell if someone is protecting the protagonist, manipulating him, or quietly setting him up to fail. Every conversation feels like it's balancing on the edge of a knife. The script plays with repetition in a way that deepens the protagonist's descent. Certain phrases echo back throughout the film, first said in quiet resignation, then later in rising desperation, and finally as bitter truths. These repeated lines gain new weight as the protagonist's understanding of his situation unravels. They aren't catchphrases, they're haunting mantras that evolve as his mission corrodes his sanity. The film also weaponizes omission in its writing. Key information is withheld not through convoluted plot tricks, but through characters deliberately refusing to answer. When someone says, "You don't want to know what that costs," and leaves it hanging, it's more devastating than a detailed explanation. The script leans into these half-said warnings and dropped conversations, letting the audience live inside the gaps where dread festers. There's also an incredible use of language barriers in the script. The protagonist often stumbles through situations where he doesn't fully speak the language, where translations come in fractured pieces, where words are lost or twisted in the transfer. This isn't played for confusion, it's played for disorientation. The script uses these moments to show how isolated he is, how precarious his grasp is on the world he's forced into, and how much he's relying on scraps of information to survive. Even the quietest lines in the script feel carved from stone. When the protagonist, exhausted, battered, and cornered, mutters, "It doesn't matter who started this," it hits like a sledgehammer because it's a moment of grim surrender to the unstoppable machinery around him. The script knows how to land these moments without fanfare, letting the weight of the story settle into the smallest, most intimate lines. The way characters talk around their pain instead of through it makes the emotional moments sting even harder. A former agent trying to offer something like comfort doesn't hand the protagonist an easy pep talk. He just says, "There's nothing at the end of this road. Walk it anyway." It's not grand, it's not inspiring, but it's devastatingly honest, and it perfectly captures the film's bone-deep sense of futility and persistence. The script's greatest strength is its ability to feel immediate, unpolished, and emotionally raw without ever sacrificing precision. The writing understands that sometimes the lines that define a film aren't the big, quotable statements. They're the hushed confessions, the trembling threats, the unfinished sentences that linger in the air long after the characters have left the scene. The dialogue in The Amateur 2025 doesn't just push the story forward. It digs into the cracks of every moment, pulls at the seams of every relationship, and leaves behind echoes that keep rattling long after the scene fades out. The Amateur 2025 steps into the world of espionage thrillers, but refuses to play by all the familiar rules. It walks into the genre's territory with a sharp edge, but instead of comfortably sitting alongside the slick, high-tech spy films audiences might expect, it shoves its way into a rawer, more vulnerable lane where the gadgets are minimal, the hero is painfully underprepared, and survival is far from guaranteed. This isn't the world of invincible agents who deliver quippy one-liners while dodging bullets with impossible precision. This is the world of the desperate, the broken, and the thoroughly human. The film plays with genre expectations right from the beginning. Typically, spy thrillers are packed with stylish, globe-trotting missions that hop from exotic city to exotic city, with larger-than-life villains and elaborate schemes. The Amateur 2025 flips that on its head by planting its story in a more claustrophobic, urban setting and stripping the scale down to something intimate and crushing. The central mission isn't about saving nations or stopping international catastrophes. It's about personal revenge, grief, and a man punching far above his weight class in a game he was never trained to play. The genre's usual playground of cool professionalism is replaced with messy improvisation and escalating panic. There's a deliberate rejection of the typical espionage toolkit. Where other spy films flood the screen with high-tech weaponry, surveillance drones, biometric scanners, and invisible cars, The Amateur 2025 leans into the rough edges of low-tech, last-minute solutions. The protagonist isn't flipping through an arsenal of gadgets. He's scrawling notes on crumpled paper, using burner phones that barely work, and relying on outdated maps instead of satellite imagery. The absence of flashy technology strips the genre's glossy surface away, leaving behind the bones of what makes these stories pulse with tension. Human willpower, quick thinking, and the razor-thin line between success and brutal failure. The film masterfully balances action and suspense, but not in the polished, choreographed ballet that many spy films deliver. The action here is chaotic, raw, and often uncomfortable to watch. Gunfights aren't clean. They're messy, short bursts of violence where the protagonist is scrambling for cover, breathing hard, and clearly outmatched. Fistfights aren't cinematic showcases. They're clumsy, desperate struggles where survival feels like luck as much as skill. The film rejects the genre's typical fantasy of the flawless operative, and instead pulls the audience into a world where every confrontation feels dangerous, where getting out alive isn't expected but astonishing. Suspense dominates the film's rhythm, and it does so with relentless pressure. Where other spy thrillers might lean into elaborate double-crosses and globe-spanning puzzles, this film builds its tension in tight, suffocating spaces. The suspense doesn't come from complex, layered plots with 10 players all pulling hidden strings. It comes from the simple, terrifying question: can this man survive the next 5 minutes? The genre's usual chessboard is reduced to a brutal sprint, and that immediacy makes the film pulse with anxiety. Every time the protagonist picks up a phone, walks into a new building, or steps into a dark alley, the audience knows that his inexperience could get him killed at any second. The film doesn't abandon genre tropes entirely. It carefully selects which ones to use and twists them just enough to make them feel fresh. There are secret meetings, double agents, shadowy organizations, but they are presented without the sleek cinematic polish. The meetings are in cheap cafes. The double agents aren't charming manipulators, but weary operatives who have traded so many sides they've forgotten which one they were on to begin with. The shadowy organizations aren't faceless empires. They're worn-down bureaucracies with flickering lights, dusty file rooms, and more paperwork than mystery. By grounding these elements in such an unglamorous world, the film makes even familiar genre beats feel new and alive. Humor exists in the film, but it's bone-dry and often delivered in the form of biting irony rather than punchy banter. The moments of levity come from the sheer absurdity of the protagonist's situation. He's constantly navigating a world where he doesn't belong, fumbling through spy jargon, misreading signals, and making mistakes that no seasoned operative would ever make. The humor doesn't come from characters trying to be funny. It comes from the brutal honesty of someone who realizes, often too late, just how far out of his depth he really is. These moments of dark humor don't break the tension. They sharpen it by reminding the audience that the protagonist is painfully human in a genre that often celebrates the superhuman. One of the most fascinating ways the film plays with genre conventions is in its refusal to make the protagonist a hero in the traditional sense. He doesn't grow into a professional spy, he doesn't suddenly master the trade, and he doesn't glide into the final act with perfect precision. He remains the amateur until the bitter end, and the film leans into that discomfort. His inexperience isn't just a hurdle, it's baked into every choice, every fight, every miscalculation. The film doesn't follow the typical genre arc where the underdog becomes the master. It stays brutally honest about what happens when someone like him charges into a world designed to chew people up. The emotional weight is another place where the film separates itself from its genre peers. Many spy thrillers treat personal loss as a motivator, but rarely explore the lingering grief in depth. In The Amateur 2025, the grief isn't just a backstory. It's the fuel that burns through every decision the protagonist makes. The genre's common themes of loyalty, betrayal, and duty are present, but are pushed aside in favor of raw, unprocessed pain. The protagonist isn't trying to protect his country or unravel some global conspiracy. He's just trying to claw his way through his own guilt and rage. This deeply personal focus flips the genre's usual stakes on their head and pulls the audience into a story that feels sharper, smaller, but infinitely more intense. The pacing avoids the sleek roller coaster highs and lows that many spy thrillers love to ride. It doesn't pause for the obligatory training montage, the gadget showcase, or the slow-motion escape sequence. It keeps the pressure tight and steady, grinding forward without giving the protagonist, or the audience, a moment to fully exhale. The film treats each setback as a bruise that doesn't fade, each success as something that costs more than it was worth. The genre's traditional rhythm is broken down into a series of sprints and stumbles rather than perfectly orchestrated peaks. The film also introduces fresh energy into the genre. by focusing on the consequences of amateurism in a world that usually rewards professionalism. It challenges the assumption that determination can outmatch training, that heart can overcome precision. It forces the audience to confront the brutal reality that stepping into this world without the right tools, connections, or preparation usually doesn't end well. And yet it never pulls away from the protagonist's refusal to quit, even as the genre seems to push back against him at every turn. The Amateur 2025 understands the bones of the spy thriller, and chooses which pieces to keep, which to crack open, and which to discard completely. The Amateur 2025 doesn't loudly announce its social and cultural commentary, but it threads these ideas so tightly into its fabric that they feel impossible to separate from the story. The film doesn't stop to lecture, it doesn't break its pacing to drop grand political speeches, but beneath the pulse-pounding chase and raw desperation, it quietly builds a sharp critique of modern systems, the dehumanizing machinery of bureaucracy, and the overwhelming weight of institutional power. It speaks volumes about the world we live in, not by stepping outside its story, but by trapping its protagonist in situations that echo real-world frustrations, failures, and fears. At its core, the film is a brutal dissection of how easily individuals can be chewed up by the very systems they trust to protect them. The protagonist's struggle isn't just against the faceless enemies who targeted his fiancée. It's against the cold, indifferent agencies that are more interested in closing cases than saving lives. The government bureaucracy depicted here isn't some all-seeing, efficient force. It's slow, fractured, disorganized, and steeped in apathy. The protagonist's grief and rage are met with red tape, half-hearted apologies, and endless forms to fill out. The film is quietly, persistently furious about this. About how quickly victims can become statistics, how easily stories can be buried under procedural delays and security clearances. This commentary on institutional failure is woven directly into the protagonist's path, not layered on top as a side issue, but placed right at the heart of his motivation and frustration. The film also touches the pulse of modern anxieties about surveillance and privacy, without leaning into dystopian exaggeration. It builds a world where tracking someone is disturbingly easy, where personal data is currency traded by people the protagonist never even meets. It's not a flashy hacker's playground. It's a subdued, chilling depiction of how exposed people are in their daily lives. Camera feeds, financial records, phone metadata. The film shows how these pieces are snapped up and used against him with ruthless efficiency. It's not science fiction. It's a reflection of the digital footprint everyone leaves behind, and the film paints this as both terrifying and depressingly normal. The protagonist isn't shocked by this power. He's simply crushed by the realization that he can't outmaneuver it. There's a deeply embedded commentary about power hierarchies, especially in how intelligence agencies, law enforcement, and contractors operate in their own circles, insulated from accountability. The protagonist's amateur status isn't just a lack of training, it's a lack of access. He's locked out of the corridors of power, shoved to the margins where he has to bargain, plead, and threaten just to get basic information. This isn't the story of someone rising through the ranks to earn his place. It's the story of someone slamming into locked doors again and again, doors that stay closed to people without connections, titles, or clearance. The film captures the suffocating frustration of being the wrong kind of person in a system designed to keep power concentrated. On a cultural level, the film doesn't shy away from the cold realism of how disposable people become in these structures. The protagonist's fiancée isn't targeted because she's part of some sweeping conspiracy. She's collateral damage, a byproduct of the careless, grinding gears of international dealings. The tragedy here isn't a grand, orchestrated evil. It's the quiet, impersonal decisions made by people who never think about the bodies left in the aftermath. The film's social commentary hits hardest in these moments, where life and death are reduced to manageable risks, acceptable losses, and forgotten footnotes in someone else's report. The story also dips into the moral gray zones of revenge, justice, and the idea of acceptable responses to trauma. The protagonist's refusal to let go of his mission becomes a study of obsession, but it also questions who gets to decide when a pursuit for justice crosses the line. The film doesn't frame his quest as noble or heroic. It lets the audience sit with the discomfort of watching someone dismantle themselves in the name of retribution. This opens up a quiet commentary on the seductive nature of personal vengeance, and how quickly it can spiral into something self-destructive. It doesn't offer easy answers or moral lessons. It just lays out the wreckage and forces the audience to grapple with what's left. The film's global settings bring in subtle commentary on cultural barriers and the uneven power dynamics between countries and agencies. The protagonist is constantly out of step in environments where language, social norms, and local alliances shift faster than he can adapt. He's often treated as an outsider, not just by the agencies but by the people in the streets, the bartenders, the informants, the everyday workers who see him as another desperate foreigner stumbling into things he doesn't understand. The film refuses to gloss over this cultural dissonance. Instead, it uses it to highlight how people like the protagonist can find themselves crushed not just by power structures, but by the quiet alienation that comes from being out of place, out of sync, and out of options. There's a recurring commentary on the emotional cost of the work that agents, analysts, and operatives carry. The people the protagonist meets aren't glamorous spies. They're burned out, jaded, and hollowed by the years they've spent lying, betraying, and watching people die. Some of them are too tired to care, some are desperately clinging to fragments of their own conscience, and some have fully embraced the moral numbness that comes with the job. The film doesn't turn these characters into villains or saints. It presents them as complex survivors of a system that slowly erodes their humanity. Through these portrayals, the film taps into the idea that prolonged exposure to violence and institutional callousness doesn't always create monsters. It sometimes just creates ghosts. The film also scrapes against the edges of how media manipulates perception. There are glimpses of news reports spinning events in real time, of headlines reshaping the public's understanding before the truth even surfaces. The protagonist's story is never the one that gets told. He's moving through shadows while the world's attention is carefully directed elsewhere. This speaks to the quiet erasure that happens when narratives are controlled by people who have the power to shape public focus, leaving the real story buried under layers of distraction, misinformation, or deliberate silence. The way the film handles these social and cultural threads feels natural, never forced or tacked on for relevance. They grow out of the story's bones, woven into the protagonist's struggles, and the spaces he occupies. The film never pauses to shine a spotlight on these themes. They're embedded in the bureaucracy that ignores him, in the surveillance that chokes him, in the power structures that dismiss him, in the cultural barriers that isolate him, and in the quiet, devastating realization that in a world of faceless systems, sometimes the worst outcome isn't death, it's being forgotten entirely. The commentary runs like a current beneath the story, pulling the audience along whether they notice it or not, building a portrait of a world that feels painfully familiar, frighteningly indifferent, and inescapably real. The Amateur 2025 doesn't just tell its story, it drags the audience into its raw, relentless emotional storm and refuses to let go. The film's grip is tight, sometimes suffocating, sometimes electrifying, always immersive. It's not designed for casual consumption. It demands that viewers lean in, feel every misstep, every desperate breath, every brutal consequence. From the very first moment, the audience isn't simply watching a man chase revenge. They are locked inside his unraveling world, riding each wave of panic, grief, and spiraling obsession as if their own survival depends on it. The emotional pull is intense because the film isn't interested in the clean, heroic victories that usually punctuate thrillers. It's committed to making the audience sit inside the discomfort, inside the escalating stakes where the protagonist's grief and desperation bleed into every frame. The connection with the main character builds not because he's charming or because he's good at what he's doing, but because he's so painfully human. He's the guy who's in way over his head, who stumbles, who breaks, who makes the wrong call even when his heart is in the right place. His vulnerability is so present, so exposed, that viewers can't help but root for him, even when they know the odds are stacked against him. There are moments that hit like a gut punch, not because they're huge, loud spectacles, but because they creep up in quiet, brutal ways. A phone call that cuts off too soon, a whispered plea that gets ignored, a simple question that lands like a blade. These are the kinds of scenes that pull the air right out of the room and hit the audience with a weight that lingers long after the credits roll. The film doesn't push for tears with swelling music or overacted tragedy. It earns its emotional impact through restraint, through the unbearable stillness between collapsing moments, through the suffocating silence that wraps around the protagonist's isolation. Shock hits in unexpected ways. The film isn't stuffed with cheap twists or predictable betrayals. It's packed with decisions that feel horrifyingly real. There are brutal, sudden moments where the protagonist trusts the wrong person, or takes a step that instantly backfires, and the audience feels that sharp sting right alongside him. The surprises aren't theatrical. They're devastating because they make perfect sense in the world the film builds. The realism makes the shocks cut deeper. There's no padding, no last-minute rescues, just consequences that hit with the blunt force of inevitability. The suspense is almost unbearable in some stretches. The way the film builds tension doesn't rely on massive action set pieces. It relies on the relentless tightening of small, personal stakes. A scene where the protagonist quietly follows someone through a crowded station can be more pulse-pounding than a car chase, because the camera and sound design pull the audience so deeply into his paranoia and fear. The film weaponizes the mundane. A slow walk down a corridor, a gloved hand reaching for a door handle, a quiet knock at the wrong time. These moments land like bombs because the audience is so thoroughly invested in what's at risk. There's a kind of raw satisfaction in watching the protagonist's scrappy, sometimes disastrous attempts to outmaneuver trained professionals. Viewers find themselves cheering not for flawless victories, but for the sheer stubbornness that keeps him moving. Every tiny win feels monumental because they're so hard-earned and so precarious. The audience rides that constant edge between hope and dread, knowing that each step forward could just as easily collapse beneath him. The film also delivers moments that invite fierce discussion. It doesn't hand out easy answers, and the choices the protagonist makes are often morally tangled and deeply uncomfortable. Viewers are likely to walk away asking themselves whether he was justified, whether his mission was worth the wreckage he leaves behind, and whether grief is ever something that can be channeled without becoming self-destructive. The film invites debates about revenge, about the cost of obsession, and about whether someone like the protagonist, untrained, emotionally shattered, and consumed by rage, should ever have stepped into this world in the first place. Repeat viewings become tempting, not because the film is packed with hidden clues or twisty timelines, but because the emotional layers are so tightly packed. On a first watch, the audience is often too swept up in the sheer momentum to notice the smaller details. The flicker of regret in a side character's eyes, the half-heard warning in the background, the way locations subtly shift to mirror the protagonist's descent. Watching it again peels back those surface layers and reveals the quiet precision buried in every conversation, every glance, every silence. The film is also packed with emotionally sticky lines that loop in the audience's head long after the story is over. A bitter warning, a whispered goodbye, a muttered threat. These moments aren't grand, but they lodge themselves in the mind, triggering flashes of the film's most intense beats. The script plants these seeds that sprout later, sometimes days after watching, as viewers replay conversations and realize how much was unsaid, how much was sitting just beneath the surface. There's a particular kind of emotional exhaustion that the Amateur 2025 gives its audience, and strangely, that's part of what makes it so powerful. It wears viewers down in the same way it wears the protagonist down, pulling them into his frantic mindset, his bone-deep weariness, his stubborn refusal to collapse even when every step drags him closer to ruin. It's the kind of film that leaves people sitting in silence as the credits roll, feeling like they've just survived something with the characters on screen. The film's emotional honesty is brutal. It doesn't offer comforting resolutions, it doesn't reward the audience with a clean victory, and it doesn't wrap grief into a neat, cinematic package. It leaves jagged edges exposed. It trusts the viewers to carry that discomfort with them, to sit with the aftermath, to question what they've just seen and what they would have done if they'd been the one holding the map, the gun, the phone. It doesn't hand out answers. It just plunges the audience into the mess and lets them find their own way out. The result is a story that resonates, echoes, and clings like smoke long after the final frame fades. The Amateur 2025 doesn't just walk into the crowded landscape of spy thrillers. It carves out its own brutal, stripped-down corner, and refuses to conform to the sleek, formula-driven blueprints that many in the genre follow. When lined up against the towering giants of the spy world, Films that flaunt globe-trotting agents with endless resources, flashy gadgets, and high-stakes political conspiracies. The Amateur 2025 immediately stands apart. This film doesn't belong to the lineage of James Bond's bulletproof swagger, Jason Bourne's surgical precision, or Ethan Hunt's death-defying stunts. It pushes itself into the underbelly of the genre, right alongside those raw, gritty stories that trade in panic, vulnerability, and cold, hard survival. When placed next to the clinical efficiency of the Bourne films, the difference is striking. Bourne operates with an almost superhuman competence, navigating deadly situations with the reflexes and skills of someone who was made for this life. The Amateur 2025 tears that illusion apart. Its protagonist doesn't know the terrain, doesn't have backup, and doesn't have the training to breeze through complex operations. Where Bourne's fights are brutal but graceful, the battles here are messy, panicked, and painfully human. Where Bourne outwits entire agencies, this man struggles to outlast his own fear. The pacing of the film echoes Bourne's intensity, but deliberately avoids the genre's obsession with mastery. It trades fluid expertise for desperate improvisation. Compared to Taken, another revenge-fueled thriller with a grieving lead, The Amateur 2025 strips away the almost mythic competency that defines Brian Mills. There are no perfect headshots, no phone calls dripping with icy confidence, no controlled takedowns in crowded airports. The protagonist in The Amateur 2025 doesn't come equipped with a very particular set of skills. He comes equipped with raw grief and blind determination. And the film thrives in that uncomfortable place where a man's willpower simply isn't enough to guarantee his success. Where Taken provides a revenge fantasy with carefully calculated victories, The Amateur 2025 delivers something closer to a nightmare, where each success feels like survival borrowed from chance, not earned through training. When stacked up against John Wick, another revenge-driven franchise, the contrast becomes even sharper. Wick's world is hyper-stylized, full of secret societies, elegant gun-fu choreography, and a deep mythology that invites the audience into its ballet of violence. The Amateur 2025 deliberately rejects that sheen. There are no clean shootouts, no neon-drenched corridors, no unspoken codes of honor among assassins. Instead, it slogs through cold stairwells, filthy alleyways, and dingy cafes. Where Wick moves with the precision of a legend, the protagonist here moves like a man dragging his grief through a maze he barely understands. Wick's kills feel operatic. This film's kills feel clumsy, raw, and ugly. Even when compared to more grounded thrillers like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, The Amateur 2025 refuses to lean into the cerebral, puzzle box structure that defines many slow-burn espionage films. It isn't interested in labyrinthine conspiracies or patient, dialogue-heavy intrigue. Where Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy dissects the Cold War's quiet tension, The Amateur 2025 is about heat. It's about the raw burn of grief that pushes a man to smash his way through doors instead of unlocking them. The paranoia is there, the danger is there, but the rhythm is less measured and more urgent, pulsing through every mistake and misstep. The film doesn't ask the audience to lean back and untangle. It demands they lean forward and hang on. Looking at the director's filmography, if the director is known for tight, controlled thrillers or polished action dramas, The Amateur 2025 feels like a sharp left turn, a deliberate venture into chaos and imperfection. Where previous works might have showcased heroes who operated with a kind of cinematic rhythm and mastery, this film offers something deliberately jagged, unsmoothed, and painfully grounded. If the director's earlier films have dealt with themes of power, control, and precise maneuvering, this story flips that on its head by showcasing what happens when a man has no power, no control, and no playbook to rely on. If the director's earlier work is known for clean resolutions or characters who triumph over impossible odds, this film claws into a space that thrives on ambiguity, moral corrosion, and the emotional mess left behind after the last bullet has been fired. It feels like the director intentionally stepped away from comfort zones to explore what happens when everything goes wrong and nothing fits neatly into place. When compared to other amateur in the world of spies films like Jack Ryan or Body of Lies, The Amateur 2025 does something very different by refusing to let its protagonists grow into the system. Jack Ryan, for example, often finds his footing quickly, earning his place among professionals and gradually becoming a peer to the people who initially outclass him. In The Amateur 2025, the protagonist never reaches that point. He remains the outsider, the fumbling figure in the margins, the man who never quite learns the right language or the right steps. This refusal to let him evolve into a seasoned operative gives the film a unique texture. It stays true to its title and its brutal commitment to realism. The film's willingness to subvert genre expectations positions it alongside the darker, more emotionally raw thrillers like The Constant Gardener or Green Zone, where the central mission is tangled with grief, guilt, and a steady realization that the system will never bend in your favor. But even here, The Amateur 2025 feels like it's moving at a different frequency. It's faster, more desperate, less polished, and constantly teetering on the edge of collapse. What truly sets this film apart is its complete rejection of the power fantasy that drives so many stories in this space. It doesn't offer the viewer a chance to imagine themselves as an unstoppable agent with a plan for every corner. It offers something much more frightening. It asks what you would do if you were the wrong person for the job, but you had to do it anyway. It asks what happens when a grieving man refuses to let his own helplessness stop him, when he charges headfirst into a world where everyone else knows the rules except him. It strips the genre down to its nerves and lets the audience feel every tremor, every fracture, every heartbeat. It doesn't just stand next to its genre siblings. It steps away from the polished crowd, hands bloody, lungs burning, daring the audience to follow. The Amateur 2025 may present itself as a raw, straightforward thriller, but underneath the grit and panic, the film is pulsing with symbolism and carefully planted metaphors that quietly reshape the way its story is experienced. These layers don't shout for attention. They linger in the background, they haunt the edges of the frame. They slip into the story like whispered warnings, and it's only when you start peeling them back that you realize just how much the film has been saying without ever needing to spell it out. One of the most powerful recurring motifs is the map. Throughout the film, the protagonist carries a worn, crumpled paper map, something almost embarrassingly out of place in a world of GPS tracking and satellite images. It's his constant companion, a tool he clings to even when everyone else has moved on to digital precision. The map becomes much more than a navigation device. It's a symbol of his outdated approach, his desperate attempt to chart a course through a landscape he no longer understands. It represents his stubbornness, his refusal to adapt, and his obsession with finding his way back to something that's already gone. The map is his link to his fiancée, to the life he lost, to the journey he can't seem to complete. As it becomes more tattered and torn, it mirrors his own unraveling, the way he's slowly losing himself as he pursues his mission to the bitter end. The film's use of doorways and thresholds builds another layer of metaphor. Doors appear again and again, often as physical barriers the protagonist must force his way through. But they also represent moments of choice, of transition, of irreversible steps. The camera lingers on his hand resting on door handles, on the slow push as he crosses into new spaces, each time leaving something behind. These doors mark the passage from one emotional state to another, from hesitation to rage, from fear to recklessness. Some doors slam shut behind him, symbolizing the bridges he's burned and the people he's lost, while others remain stubbornly locked, reminding him of the institutional walls he cannot penetrate. The film doesn't need to say it out loud. The doors tell the story of his gradual isolation and the narrowing of his world. Mirrors become silent witnesses throughout the film. The protagonist frequently encounters his own reflection, but instead of using them for slick action poses or introspective pauses, the mirrors in The Amateur 2025 often catch him at his weakest, his most disheveled, his most frantic. The mirror isn't a tool for self-awareness. It's a constant, cruel reminder of what he's becoming. The more he pushes forward, the more the man in the reflection becomes a stranger to him. Cracked, dirty, half-lit mirrors reflect not just his physical wear and tear but his fractured sense of identity, his disintegration as he strays further from the life he once knew. The refusal to show him clearly, to give him a perfect reflection, underscores the way he's lost hold of who he is. The film plays with light and shadow in ways that subtly reinforce the story's emotional weight. The protagonist often finds himself trapped in spaces where the light is just out of reach. Dim stairwells, flickering street lamps, half-illuminated hallways. He's always moving toward light that never fully embraces him. The world seems determined to keep him in a perpetual dusk, where clarity is always just beyond his grasp. Even when he does find brightly lit spaces, they often feel cold, sterile, unforgiving, as if there's no warmth waiting for him at the end of his journey. The absence of true illumination speaks to the impossibility of closure, of finding a clean answer, of reaching the comfort he's chasing. Phones and communication devices serve as recurring, loaded symbols. They are the lifelines he grasps at, the tools that constantly betray him, the connections that always seem to fray at the worst possible moment. The protagonist spends a significant part of the film calling people who won't answer, chasing leads that hang up on him, leaving messages that are never returned. The phone becomes a symbol of distance, of the brutal realization that information is power, and that power is something that will never fully belong to him. Each dropped call, each cut-off conversation, reinforces his position as the outsider, the amateur, the man no one is obligated to help. Water appears throughout the film as a subtle, recurring visual marker tied to the protagonist's grief. It shows up in rain-slick streets, in dripping faucets, in the condensation on glass, always quietly present in his moments of greatest despair or reflection. The presence of water feels like a visual echo of his grief, a constant reminder of what he's drowning in emotionally. Water becomes tied to memory. It rains in the flashbacks, in the fragments of his past with his fiancée, and the moments when he is most tempted to give up often find him standing in puddles, in downpours, as if the weight of his memories is seeping into the ground around him. It's a quiet metaphor, but it lingers, adding depth to his emotional state without a single word needing to be spoken. The visual framing of the protagonist often places him on the margins of the screen, rarely in the center. This isn't an accident. It's a recurring visual metaphor that emphasizes his displacement, his status as a man out of his depth and out of his place. He's frequently seen walking beside, not through, crowds. He stands at the edges of rooms, half in shadow, never fully integrated into the spaces he moves through. This off-center positioning visually reinforces his amateur status, his outsider perspective, and the way he's always one step removed from the power structures that control the world around him. Trains and subways are used as a motif of uncontrollable momentum. Throughout the film, trains serve as both literal transportation and symbolic representations of the journey he can't get off of, no matter how much danger it pulls him toward. The rhythmic pounding of the tracks, the confinement of subway cars, the facelessness of the crowds. These moments hammer home the idea that once set in motion, his course is almost impossible to derail. The trains don't stop for him, they don't wait, they don't care if he's ready. They reflect the cold machinery of the larger world, a system that's barreling forward regardless of his grief, his mission, or his survival. Even the film's color palette carries symbolic weight. The persistent use of washed-out grays, muted blues, and dirty whites creates an emotional atmosphere of exhaustion and detachment. Bursts of color are rare, and often linked to moments from his past or to sudden flashes of violence. When color does flood the frame, it's jarring. It disrupts the film's visual rhythm and slams the audience into the protagonist's headspace, where emotion comes in brief, searing waves before fading back into the gray. This deliberate control of color builds a subconscious emotional map for the viewer, pulling them deeper into the protagonist's experience without ever needing to explain why it feels so heavy. The amateurism itself is a metaphor that quietly spreads across the entire story. It's not just about the protagonist's lack of training. It becomes a metaphor for grief, for how unprepared people are to navigate profound personal loss. The Amateur 2025 is not part of a long-running franchise or a multi-film cinematic universe, and it doesn't lean on any established spy saga with interconnected storylines, but that's exactly what makes its place in the broader film landscape so fascinating. It steps into a genre so heavily populated by sequels, spin-offs, and sprawling interconnected missions, yet it stands alone, almost defiantly isolated. It doesn't need returning characters, it doesn't need to build bridges to other films, and it certainly doesn't waste time planting sequel hooks or weaving in threads for future expansions. It thrives as a contained story, existing firmly in its own space, focusing all its energy on the personal, intimate chaos of one man's mission. The choice to keep this film disconnected from a larger franchise is part of its DNA. It's built to reject the franchise blueprint where characters often survive, because the next installment demands their return. In The Amateur 2025, survival is not promised, success is not inevitable, and character arcs don't feel like stepping stones to the next film. They feel final, dangerous, and immediate. The weight of each decision lands with real consequence because there's no safety net of ongoing stories to soften the blows. The protagonist doesn't carry the burden of past films, and there's no obligation to push him into future ones. That freedom allows the story to remain brutally focused on the here and now, on the jagged edges of grief, revenge, and desperation. But even without being part of a franchise, the film understands the weight of genre history. It plays with the audience's expectations that have been carefully trained by decades of spy thrillers, revenge sagas, and action spectacles. Viewers walk in expecting certain beats. The calm, collected mentor, the slick training montage, the thrilling last-minute rescue. The quiet confirmation that this amateur will eventually become a pro. But The Amateur 2025 systematically refuses to deliver those expected moments. It acknowledges the genre's long shadow but carves its own path by stripping away the polish, the neat resolutions, and the clean progression arcs that so often define franchise installments. If this film were placed alongside entries from major spy franchises like Mission Impossible, James Bond, or even Jason Bourne, its refusal to follow those well-trodden franchise patterns becomes even more stark. In those worlds, the stakes might be global, but the heroes tend to operate with an unshakable competence, moving through layers of danger with resources always just within reach. The Amateur 2025 slams the door on that fantasy. Its protagonist is out of his depth, lacking the training, the gadgets, the connections, or even the reliable allies that franchise heroes usually enjoy. The story never offers him a seat at the table with the professionals. He remains the outsider from beginning to end, a man clawing for relevance in a world where the power structures have already dismissed him. This rejection of the traditional franchise arc creates a refreshing tension that never dissolves into comfort or predictability. The film also plays directly into the growing appetite for standalone, self-contained narratives that don't require viewers to do homework before watching. In a cinematic landscape where audiences are increasingly expected to track multiverses, spin-offs, and post-credit teases, The Amateur 2025 stands as a sharp contrast. There's something liberating about its simplicity, a story that begins, spirals, and concludes entirely on its own terms, without needing to answer to a wider mythology. This makes it feel immediate, more personal, more grounded, and more brutal, because there's no bigger picture that needs protecting. If viewed through the lens of historical relevance, while the story itself isn't based on true events, it feels tightly connected to the modern world's social and political anxieties. It taps directly into the post-9/11 intelligence landscape, the messy, fragmented reality of global surveillance, the unspoken bureaucracy that governs international cooperation, and the dehumanizing machinery of counterterrorism. It might not be a historical film in the traditional sense, but it carries the weight of real-world structures and failures that audiences can recognize instantly. It feels like a story born from the last 2 decades of intelligence mistakes, drone warfare, cross-border black sites, and the faceless algorithms that now dominate modern conflict. The film's immersion in this world is disturbingly realistic. It doesn't paint espionage as a glamorous profession. It paints it as a series of cold decisions, impersonal sacrifices, and endless files on people who don't know their names are being cataloged. It doesn't rely on dramatic historical recreations, but it does mirror the systemic failures that have shaped the way intelligence is viewed in the modern era. Bureaucratic indifference, international miscommunication, and the expendability of human lives are all portrayed with painful accuracy, not as exaggerated plot devices, but as the quiet, grinding truth of the machine the protagonist is up against. If the story were pulled from the headlines, it wouldn't feel out of place. The Amateur's fight against overwhelming odds echoes real stories of people who have been trapped in systems that failed them. People who were treated as collateral damage in larger power plays. People who found themselves stonewalled by agencies that should have helped them but instead buried their pleas under endless forms and unreturned calls. The film may not tie itself to a specific historical moment, but it vibrates with the tension of the world's very real, ongoing geopolitical games, giving it a weight that feels impossible to dismiss. If The Amateur 2025 were ever to spawn sequels or a franchise in the future, it would have to abandon the very DNA that makes this story so effective. The film's raw power comes from the fact that this is not a stepping stone. It's a complete plunge into chaos that doesn't offer the clean trajectories that sequels often demand. It stands in proud defiance of the idea that a film must always be part of something larger to matter. It tells one story, fully, brutally, and without reservation, and it refuses to dilute that experience by tying itself to a broader universe. In a cinematic world where franchises dominate screens and historical films often feel like carefully curated tours of the past, The Amateur 2025 carves its own relentless path. It acknowledges the genre's past, it nods to the systems we know all too well, but it forges ahead as its own beast, messy, isolated, unforgiving, and fully committed to the idea that some stories don't need sequels, spin-offs, or shared worlds to leave a lasting mark. The Amateur 2025 entered the cinematic arena with a budget that surprised many industry watchers. It didn't carry the ballooning price tags that often come attached to modern spy thrillers dripping with globe-trotting set pieces, elaborate car chases, and armies of digital artists working around the clock. Instead, the film's budget sat comfortably in the mid-range bracket, which is a bold move in a market obsessed with either low-budget indies or gargantuan blockbusters. This mid-tier budget became one of the film's greatest assets because it forced the production to make creative, calculated choices about where to spend and where to strip things back. The budget allocation leaned heavily into practical locations, tight action sequences, and grounded tension rather than pouring funds into visual spectacle or world-building extravagance. The result? The film feels refreshingly raw. There's an intentional absence of the usual genre eye candy. No sprawling set designs of villainous lairs, no massive CGI-assisted explosions that light up skylines. Instead, what the budget delivers is a sharp focus on the protagonist's journey, gritty urban environments, and practical stunts that carry more weight precisely because they don't feel surgically choreographed. There's something satisfying about watching a film that looks like every dollar went into what mattered: tension, character, and relentless pacing, rather than flashy but hollow visuals. Box office expectations for The Amateur 2025 were interesting from the beginning. It wasn't positioned to dominate opening weekend in the same way that a franchise tentpole would. It wasn't sold as the next big cinematic event. Instead, it was aimed at a more niche, grown-up audience looking for a thriller that doesn't rely on high-concept gimmicks or superhero-sized spectacle. Its financial performance reflected this strategy. The opening weekend was modest but steady, not a blowout, but the film demonstrated serious staying power. Word of mouth became the driving engine behind its box office endurance. Audiences connected with the story's raw energy and its grounded protagonist, and this fueled repeat viewings and a gradual increase in ticket sales as curiosity spread. Marketing played a fascinating role in shaping the film's financial journey. The promotional push leaned hard into the film's emotional core and the ordinary man angle. Trailers focused on the desperation and the character's vulnerability rather than promising slick, over-the-top action sequences. This approach set it apart from the sea of high-octane trailers that flood the market and carved out a space where audiences knew they were walking into something different. Marketing didn't try to compete with massive action spectacles. It doubled down on what made the film unique, and that focus resonated. It found its audience not through mass saturation, but through sharp targeting and letting the film's reputation do most of the heavy lifting. Interestingly, the film's slower international rollout turned into an advantage. Some films fade quickly after their initial release, but The Amateur 2025 seemed to build momentum with each new market it entered. It became the kind of movie people recommended to each other with the quiet intensity of sharing a well-kept secret. Streaming rights were secured in key territories shortly after the theatrical release, which gave the film a second life. It didn't just disappear after its cinema run. It continued to build its following on digital platforms, where its tight pacing and emotional punch made it perfect for home viewing. The film's financial success wasn't the kind that would be splashed across headlines for record-breaking numbers, but it hit exactly where it needed to. It earned back its production costs and turned a respectable profit without leaning on inflated budgets or box office fireworks. Its earnings were a slow, steady climb rather than a sharp weekend spike, and that made it feel like a genuine audience-driven success story, rather than a carefully engineered studio juggernaut. Audience reception became the real financial driver. Reviews and viewer reactions pointed to the film's emotional depth and the relatability of the protagonist as the reasons people kept showing up. The lead actor's performance became a key selling point that fueled discussion and drew in viewers who might have skipped yet another spy thriller if it looked like a formula they'd seen a dozen times before. People weren't coming for the spectacle. They were coming to watch an amateur fight against a system that had no place for him. And they were staying because the film delivered an experience that hit much closer to home than they expected. The production's decision to avoid bloated expenses turned out to be a stroke of strategic brilliance. It allowed the film to take risks narratively and stylistically without needing to chase the largest possible audience. It didn't have to appeal to everyone. It had to appeal deeply to the right audience, and it did exactly that. Its box office performance told a story not of overnight dominance, but of slow-burning relevance, of a film that proved you don't need to spend a fortune to build intensity, craft suspense, and punch straight into the emotional core of your viewers. What's even more interesting is how the film's success continued in secondary markets. When it hit digital platforms, it saw a noticeable surge, particularly in demographics that typically lean toward character-driven dramas and grounded thrillers. It became a favorite among viewers looking for something more emotionally charged than bombastic and more human than superhuman. This secondary wave of financial success reinforced the film's strategy. Build something that lasts, something that resonates, something that doesn't burn out after the first weekend. The film's careful balance between budget, production quality, and marketing created a ripple effect that many big-budget films often miss. It didn't spend to impress. It spent to connect. And that connection turned into ticket sales, streams, and a growing reputation that carried the film far beyond its modest opening. The financial story of The Amateur 2025 is one of precision, patience, and the power of crafting a thriller that knows exactly where its impact should land. The Amateur 2025 is the kind of film that asks to be experienced with your full attention, preferably in a setting where you can feel every tense moment, every quickened breath, and every heartbeat that pounds in rhythm with the desperate mission unfolding on screen. When it first arrived, this film had a limited theatrical rollout, but it found its home and its true audience in the spaces where the story could linger, where people could sit with its tension without the distraction of a roaring crowd, or the buzz of a packed multiplex. In theaters, it offered a tight, intimate atmosphere that didn't rely on grand visuals or overpowering soundtracks, but thrived on the sharp edge of personal stakes. Watching it on the big screen was like being pulled into the streets with the protagonist, feeling every inch of his fear and frustration as the walls closed in around him. But where this film really planted its flag was in its second life on streaming platforms. Once it transitioned from theaters, it became the kind of story that works best in the quiet tension of your living room, in the solitude of a midnight watch, or in the stillness of an afternoon where the weight of the story can fully settle on your shoulders. The streaming release allowed it to find its perfect rhythm, where viewers could pause, rewind, sit with the silences, and really lean into the layered storytelling without the pressure of the ticking clock or the shifting bodies of a movie theater. Watching it at home, especially with good headphones or a sound system that captures the film's precise sound design, lets the experience hit exactly where it should, with a sharp intimacy that wraps around you. Digital rentals became a great middle ground for audiences who missed the theatrical window, but wanted to dive into the film's raw energy without waiting for it to hit subscription libraries. Renting it gives viewers the freedom to choose their own pace, whether that's a tense, edge-of-your-seat one-sitting dive, or a two-part, slow-burn experience that gives you space to process the weight of each scene. The film's tight runtime and relentless pacing make it perfectly suited for that kind of rental experience. It hooks you fast and pulls you through without overstaying its welcome. For those looking for the best possible experience, this isn't a movie that demands the largest screen or the loudest speakers, but it does beg for focus. It's a film that rewards you when you turn off your phone, dim the lights, and let yourself be fully immersed in its world. The nuances in the sound design, the quiet dread in the silences, and the sharp editing all land harder when you're not distracted by background noise or outside interruptions. Whether you're watching it in theaters, streaming on your favorite platform, or renting it for a single intense viewing, the key is to give the story your undivided attention. That's where the film breathes. That's where it tightens its grip on you. This film thrives in those moments when you feel like you're right there, sitting beside the protagonist as he pieces together scraps of information and stumbles through a world that feels perpetually one step ahead of him. The closer you let it pull you in, the more it delivers on the intensity, the suspense, and the emotional gut punches. Wherever you choose to watch it, the film makes sure you're not just observing a story, you're living inside it. It's the kind of movie that stays with you not because of spectacle, but because of how it crawls under your skin and won't let go.